The first thing I need you to understand is that most hazard reports are boring on purpose. That is not me being dismissive. That is the design. If you make a living reading incident summaries, environmental compliance notes, access restrictions, crew statements, weather logs, damaged equipment inventories, and recommendations for mitigation, you get used to a very specific style of language. It is dry, repetitive, and built to flatten human experience into categories that can be filed, searched, and defended later. A report is not supposed to feel like the thing that happened. It is supposed to survive being reviewed by 3 supervisors, 1 lawyer, and somebody in procurement. By the time this happened, I'd been investigating hazard reports for the Forest Service for a little over 6 years. Not field work, not chainsaw crews, not fire line. I was one of the people who got sent the ugly leftovers after incidents that didn't fit neatly into the usual boxes. If a road washout injured a contractor because a maintenance request got ignored, that came to people like me. If a ranger district had repeated near misses around an abandoned structure, and nobody could agree whether to demolish it, secure it, or pretend it didn't exist until the next budget cycle, that came to people like me. If there was a cluster of contradictory reports from a remote work site, and the district office wanted someone to determine whether they had a safety culture problem, a personnel problem, or a liability problem, that came to people like me. Most of what I did was read reports, compare statements, trace decisions backward, and find the point where a manageable risk became a pattern that everybody had decided not to name. I was good at it because I am the kind of person people mistake for calm. What I actually am is patient in a way that can feel impolite. I do not let go of loose ends. If 2 maintenance logs disagree by 12 minutes, I notice. If a seasonal employee describes a slope as east-facing and a district engineer later calls it north-facing, I notice. It does not make me brilliant. It just makes me difficult to soothe. The file I'm talking about was not supposed to be on my desk. Not physically. We barely used paper for active review anymore. On my desk means in my queue, assigned under my name, case permissions enabled, with a review deadline attached and a neat little chain of electronic custody behind it. This one did not enter the system normally. It appeared in a sealed archive partition, flagged with an internal access notation I had only seen twice before, both times involving fatalities and federal land disputes. Even then, the files had come down with escorts from legal and a memo telling us exactly what we were and were not authorized to examine. This one came with no memo. The title line was ordinary enough to be insulting. Region 1, Bitterroot Sector. Historical Hazard Review. Restricted Circulation. Attachment Group. Withheld pending authorization. There was a date on it from 11 years earlier. Then, a revision date from 9 years earlier. Then, no activity until the morning it landed in my queue. I thought it was a permissions error. Those happen. Old archives get migrated. Retention flags break. Somebody in records clicks the wrong inheritance setting, and suddenly a dusty internal package surfaces where it doesn't belong. I sent a note to records management asking if the assignment was intentional, then opened the cover file while I waited, because curiosity is still curiosity, even when your job gives it a nicer name. The first odd thing was how little there was. A sealed historical review with restricted circulation should have had a cover memo, indexing, disposition language, and at minimum, a summary of why access had been limited. Instead, there was a 6-page administrative shell and a stack of embedded references that were visible but not openable. The shell described an investigation into repeated hazard notifications associated with non-standard acoustic events, orientation failures, and unauthorized route deviation occurring within a backcountry management zone northwest of an older, decommissioned fire lookout site. That phrasing by itself should probably mean nothing to you, so let me put it into ordinary language. People in one part of the forest kept reporting something they heard. Then they got turned around. Then they walked where they were not supposed to walk. That could still mean almost anything. Wildlife, wind through old tower rigging, recreational trespass, poor mapping, poor training, a local story that made people primed to misinterpret a normal stimulus. I had seen all of those. The administrative shell also noted that the original investigative findings had not been adopted, pending concern that formal circulation may itself increase exposure. That line was the first one that made me sit up. Safety people say stupid things all the time, but they usually say them in a predictable dialect. Increase exposure normally means publicizing a hazard might draw curiosity seekers, overwhelm a site, encourage copycat behavior, or complicate response. It usually does not refer to circulation of the report itself. I read the sentence 3 times. Then I checked the author block. 3 names. One was retired, one was dead. One I recognized because he'd become a regional safety director, and then left, under circumstances nobody ever described clearly in meetings, which generally means he either made enemies with the wrong kind of authority or learned something he was not rewarded for learning. Records still hadn't answered my email. I should have closed the file and waited. Instead, I started building a timeline from the shell. The incidents covered 14 months, 7 reports, 3 near-miss statements, 2 SAR assists, 1 abandoned vehicle recovery, 1 psychological fitness evaluation, and 1 missing person event later administratively recoded as voluntary separation from service. Same drainage system, same broad sector. Not the same exact coordinates, though all of them clustered around trails and old maintenance tracks associated with the disused lookout access route. The decommissioned tower itself had been removed in the 90s. The shell was clear on that. Footings remained. Some hardware remained. 1 utility shed foundation. Collapsed. No public access. Not a destination. Not historic enough to attract tourism. But every incident summary dragged toward it anyway. People hearing sound where no active equipment existed. People reporting a repeated tonal pattern, like a station call, which meant different things depending on the witness. One wilderness tech compared it to a NOAA weather radio caught between channels. One packer said it sounded like metal singing in cold air. One trail crew lead called it somebody trying to tune a violin with gloves on. The descriptions weren't identical, but they had the same shape. Patterned, intermittent, difficult to locate, somehow deliberate. Then there were the orientation failures. That phrase usually means a person got disoriented in terrain and made poor navigational choices. Here it had a weird consistency. The people affected did not describe being lost. They described knowing exactly where they were, then later discovering they had been wrong in ways that should have been obvious. A man walked downhill for 40 minutes and ended up above his point of departure. A seasonal hire marked a creek crossing on a GPS unit, reached camp, and later found the waypoint had been recorded from a ridge she had not climbed. One smoke jumper on off-duty recreation wrote, in the sort of embarrassed language competent people use when they need a report on record but do not want to sound unstable, that the landscape had seemed organized around the expectation that I already understood it. I copied that line into my notes. There are phrases in official writing that tell you more than a whole page of plain explanation. That was one of them. It wasn't just that he got turned around. It was that the terrain had felt cooperative while it was misleading him. By midday, I still hadn't heard back from records. I escalated to my supervisor, Carla, mostly to protect myself. Carla was not the sort of boss who rushed to stop you from making a mistake if she thought the mistake would teach you something useful, but she liked not being surprised. I walked into her office and asked, as casually as I could, if she knew why an archived historical review from Region 1 had been pushed to me without memo. She took her glasses off, which was never a good sign. Which one? I told her the title. She looked at me for a second too long. Close it. That caught my attention more than the file had. Why? Because if legal wanted you on it, legal would have told me first. That doesn't answer the question. It answers the practical one. Carla had a way of saying things that made them sound final without sounding emotional, which usually worked on most people. I stayed where I was. There's no disposition memo, I said. No circulation note except the restriction flag. The assignment was active, not inherited. Somebody surfaced it. Huh. Then somebody can fix it. She put her glasses back on and opened another email in a way that suggested the conversation was over. I did not move. After a little silence, she looked up again, annoyed now. What? The shell references withheld attachments. I can see them. I can't open them. That sounds like a problem for records. Have you heard of this case before? She stared at me, then smiled in the tight way people do when they want you to stop using the accurate version of your brain. You don't need every locked door to mean something, she said. That is exactly the kind of sentence you should not say to me. I went back to my office and closed the file. Then I reopened it from local cache. I am not telling you that because I'm proud of it. I'm telling you because once you know the shape of what happened, the smaller bad decisions matter. The sealed file did not ruin my life because it was cursed or magical or because I said the wrong thing at the wrong time. It ruined my life because it found the exact kind of mind it needed. Patient, procedural, mildly vain about its own resistance to panic, and unable to leave a pattern uncompleted. The cache version let me do something the live permissions wouldn't. I couldn't open the withheld attachments, but I could see metadata, file sizes, original names, before the archive mask. Last editor. Embedded audio indicators on 3 of them. That was enough. The attachments included crew interviews, a route map overlay, 2 field notebooks, and something called Exposure Guidance Draft V3. There was also an audio folder with timestamps corresponding to 3 separate incidents. The files were blocked, but the labels alone made the shell read differently. This was no longer just a weird cluster of hikers getting turned around. Somebody had developed guidance. Somebody had revised it multiple times. Somebody had decided not to circulate it. And now somebody wanted it looked at again. Around 2 in the afternoon, records management finally answered. The email was short. Access had not been assigned intentionally. The file had surfaced during archive remediation. They were reviewing the permission anomaly and recommended no further action pending confirmation from regional council. That should have been the end. Instead, 20 minutes later, I received a separate internal message from a sender I did not know. No signature block, no office line, just a name. A. Mercer. If you already opened the shell, do not request attachment access through the system. That creates a notice trail. If you want context, call me from outside your office. There was a phone number. No government employee should ever write like that unless they are either a fool or very sure the normal channels are part of the problem. I read the message 4 times. Then I looked up A. Mercer in the directory. No result. I should have forwarded the message to Carla. I should have documented it. I should have done at least one professional thing. Instead, I walked out to the far end of the parking lot, sat in my car, and called the number. A man answered on the second ring. Older voice. Tired, but not confused. "You're the one who got the file," he said. I said yes. "Did Carla tell you to close it?" I sat up straighter. "Who is this?" "Alan Mercer. Used to be on regional safety. Long enough ago that I can be imaginary if that makes your day easier." I didn't answer. He took that as permission to continue. "You shouldn't have that file. Since you do, you need to understand 2 things. First, the hazard was never environmental in the ordinary sense, and every attempt to classify it that way made response worse. Second, the report stayed sealed because reading it changed how people approached the area. That sounds dramatic. It sounded dramatic 11 years ago, too. That didn't help. I remember looking through the windshield at the empty rows of state vehicles baking in afternoon light and feeling, very distinctly, that I had crossed some line I had not meant to cross. Not because of what he said, exactly. Because of how little he seemed interested in convincing me. People who are lying in bureaucratic settings usually overperform certainty. Mercer sounded like someone trying to save energy. "What was the hazard?" I asked. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Pattern capture." I almost laughed. It came out more irritated than amused. That's not a real category. No. It's the least stupid term we had left. He asked what the shell had shown me. I told him the acoustic events, orientation failures, route deviation, the withheld attachments. When I mentioned the phrase about circulation increasing exposure, he said, "Yes," so softly that I almost missed it. What does that mean? It means, the more coherent the description became, the easier people found it to notice the thing the description was describing. That sentence did not make sense in any practical way. I told him so. "It didn't at first," he said. "Then it did." He asked me if the shell included the witness language from the smoke jumper. I said yes. The landscape had seemed organized around the expectation that he already understood it. Mercer exhaled. "That was Jonas. Smart guy. He got close and backed away. Better than some." "Close to what?" "The center, maybe. Or whatever passes for a center in something that recruits through recognition." I nearly ended the call then. Not because I thought he was crazy, because if I stayed on the line, I was admitting I was willing to entertain a kind of explanation I had spent my whole career training myself out of. Wildland work attracts folklore. Public lands are full of stories. Missing people, weird sounds, strange lights, old structures, local warnings. 99% of it collapses under weather, fatigue, shame, bad memory, or somebody wanting a mystery more than they want an answer. My whole job was to strip those layers off and find the durable thing underneath. But the durable thing underneath this file was not getting simpler. "Why call it pattern capture?" I asked. "Because it didn't attack people," he said. "It used their own need for consistency. The first stage was hearing something you could almost map. Then seeing terrain in a way that rewarded completion. Then following correspondences. Sound to route, route to landmark, landmark to expectation, expectation to movement. The people most affected were competent, attentive, and uncomfortable with ambiguity. That got under my skin in a way I did not like. He kept talking. You know how some hazards exploit inexperience? This one favored the opposite. If you were sloppy, distracted, or incurious, you usually just felt uneasy and left. If you were trained to observe, compare, and resolve discrepancies, you stayed with it longer. You started trying to make the pieces line up. I asked him whether anyone had actually died. He did not answer immediately. One confirmed death in the incident period we could tie probabilistically. One disappearance. We stopped trying to claim certainty after that. Probabilistically. You'd be amazed what language lets people live with. His voice changed then. More direct. "Listen carefully. Do not request the audio. Do not ask records to unseal the notebooks. Do not contact the district. And whatever you do, do not go out there believing you're just checking a site against the historical record. The site is not the problem." "What is?" "The completed model." I wish I could tell you I hung up, that I felt the weirdness of the conversation, recognized the obvious danger of self-selection bias and contagious suggestion, and walked away. That would be the version of me I would prefer to exist. Instead, I asked, "What happened to the people on the original review?" He laughed once, without humor. Same thing that happens to everybody who gets close enough to it to build language around it. One tried to turn it into procedure. One tried to erase it by preventing access. One of them kept going back until he stopped describing the trips in terms that made temporal sense. Then he said something I have not stopped hearing since. If the file found you because somebody wants it reopened, they are either very careless or they already know what happens next. The line went dead. I sat in my car for a long time. It would be cleaner for the story if I said that was the moment I knew something was wrong. The truth is, I did not think in those terms. I thought in more cowardly ones. I thought, this is either a very elaborate interpersonal mess inside an old case, or somebody is feeding me myth through an official channel because they want to obstruct review. And because I knew those were the sorts of explanations responsible adults are supposed to prefer, I let them feel more reasonable than they were. That evening, I did something else I am not proud of. I searched archive travel and site visit records tied to the case dates, not the sealed attachments, adjacent systems, vehicle checkouts, lodging reimbursements, satellite phone assignments, district calendars. Most of it was routine. Then I found a travel voucher from one of the original investigators, the man who later became regional safety director and left under the vague cloud I mentioned. 3 overnight trips to the same district after the official review period had ended. No final products linked. No completed field memo. Just mileage, per diem, 1 replacement GPS unit, and a handwritten note scanned into the receipt package. Unit unreliable after 3rd approach. You have to understand how strange that is. Government employees complain constantly, but rarely in the part of the record that accounting sees. If he wrote that there, it was because the official avenue had stopped holding whatever he was trying to say. I did not sleep much that night. Not because I was scared, because I could feel the case arranging itself in my head. Once that happens, rest becomes difficult. Every inconsistency becomes a pressure point. Every pressure point implies missing context. Missing context demands retrieval. It is a very efficient machine if you let it start. The next morning, the live file was gone from my queue. No notification, no reassignment, no audit note visible to me. Just gone. I checked the archive directly. Access denied. I checked my cache copy. Still there. Carla called me into her office before 9. She was pleasant in the way people are when they are trying not to sound like they've been informed of your bad behavior by somebody higher up. Regional Counsel cleaned up an old permissions issue, she said. That file is no longer under review. By me? By anyone in this office. I asked whether she knew a former employee named Alan Mercer. She did not answer immediately. That was answer enough. He reached out to you? She asked. I said yes. She nodded once, almost to herself, then looked tired, in a way I had never seen on her before. You need to drop this. Why? Because not every bad piece of history becomes safer when re-examined. That is not how hazards work. No, she said. But it is how some institutions work when they fail to understand a hazard and survive anyway. That was the most honest sentence I had ever heard her speak. You know what this is? I said. I know enough to tell you that no career benefit comes from being the smartest person in a room full of old damage. She stood, which was how she ended meetings without making them feel like dismissals. Take the rest of the week on your backlog. No side searching, no district calls. Let records bury their mistake. WH. 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 1 mic time. Then, more quietly, and don't go out there. She had not needed to say that unless she knew I was already considering it. For 2 days, I tried to act like a person with good judgment. I worked my other cases. I answered emails. I reviewed a contractor injury package from the Salmon Chalice and a communication breakdown report from a flood-damaged access road in Oregon. Every few hours, I told myself the same thing. The combination of official secrecy, old field incidents, and one half-credible former employee had created the perfect bait for someone like me, nothing more. Then Friday afternoon, I got another message from Mercer. They are moving the underlying materials to a dead archive. If you're still curious, the district has a structure inventory audit next week. Old Lookout Corridor will be in the route because somebody flagged remaining footings as a visitor hazard. You won't be challenged if you arrive with ordinary questions. That is not permission. It is the last point at which the thing is still mostly terrain. Mostly terrain. I stared at that phrase until my eyes hurt. He was doing exactly what he'd warned me not to do, turning private warning into procedural guidance. And because he had done that, he had made the path look manageable. I drove to Montana the following Wednesday. I told work I was taking leave and visiting family. I booked a motel in a town small enough that the front desk still had a bell, though no one was ever far enough away to need it. The room smelled like pine cleaner over old carpet. There was a diner across the road with heavy ceramic mugs and a rotating pie case that hummed all night. The sort of place where people ask you what brings you through not because they are nosy, but because movement itself is still notable there. I did not tell anyone why I was there. The district office sat outside town behind a yard full of aging vehicles and equipment cages. Nobody stopped me when I walked in. I was not exactly an outsider. Agency people can usually spot each other by posture alone. I introduced myself, said I was reviewing historical mitigation documentation related to retired structures and wanted to compare inventory notes with current site conditions. That was not true, but it was close enough to truth to move naturally. The facilities tech who helped me was a man named Brent, with a wedding ring flattened by years of manual work and a patient way of explaining things that suggested he had spent a long time dealing with people from offices. He pulled the structure inventory and frowned at one section. "This old tower corridor keeps showing up," he said. "Nobody can agree what counts as remnant hazard versus historical debris. You going up there?" "Maybe." He gave me the kind of look locals reserve for visitors who don't yet know what they are asking. "Roads washed out before the old spur. You'll have to hike in." "I've done worse." "That's not what I meant." He tapped the map. "People don't love that area." "Why?" He shrugged. "Nothing story-worthy. Folks get turned around. Radio behaves weird in the folds. Sound carries wrong. If you get weather rolling in, it can make a smart person keep proving to themselves they're not lost. Until suddenly, they are." The phrasing hit me hard enough that I had to keep my face still. It wasn't dramatic. That was what made it bad. It was practical local language, wrapped around the same pattern Mercer had described. Brent kept going. "You tell dispatch your route?" "Yes." "Good. And don't stay late. Place gets mean after 4. "Mean how?" He smiled without amusement. "Every hill decides it belongs somewhere else." I took a paper map even though I had digital copies, signed the visitor log, and left with the slow, embarrassed feeling of a man who has just had his private obsession reflected back at him by someone who treats it as weather. The trailhead was nothing special. A gravel pullout, a board with old notices sun-faded into near illegibility, a register box with a broken pencil hanging on string, standard Western access point, clean air, high light, lodge pole and fir marching upslope, the distant sound of water where you couldn't see it. It was the kind of landscape that flatters you into trust. Everything looks legible from the first mile. I'd prepared carefully. 2 maps, 1 GPS unit, backup battery, notebook, water filter, emergency bivvy, first aid kit, radio, whistle. I checked my bearings at the trailhead, checked them again, half a mile in, then once more at the washed-out spur where the old access road used to cut higher toward the lookout line. The route from there was not official trail, but the corridor still existed as a scar if you knew how to read the slope. Nothing was wrong at first. That matters. I need you to understand how normal the beginning was. Birds, wind, insects, timber smell warming in the afternoon, a place like 100 other places. Even the old road grade, once I found it, was exactly what it should have been. Half reclaimed by brush, drainage cuts softened, a few old cribbing stones exposed where runoff had eaten deeper than the original builders ever intended. The first sound came maybe 40 minutes in. Not eerie, not sudden, just unusual enough that I stopped walking. Imagine a thin metallic tone from somewhere beyond the next rise, sustained for a second and then broken into smaller notes by wind. Not music, not machinery exactly, something between resonance and signal. I stood there listening and told myself what any reasonable person would tell himself. Old wire, old metal, maybe a snagged survey marker, or forgotten hardware vibrating under tension. Then I realized the wind around me was almost still. The sound came again, 3 descending notes this time, then silence. I marked the time in my notebook. That was the first real mistake. Not because note-taking is bad, but because it changed my relationship to the event. The instant I documented it, I made it the beginning of a sequence. Once something is a sequence, your mind starts expecting recurrence. Expectation is participation. I did not know that yet. I kept moving. The road grade narrowed and then disappeared into open timber, where the old corridor should have climbed more steeply. I used the map, found a line of disturbed stones that probably marked the outer edge, and continued upward. Several times I thought I saw evidence of previous foot traffic, but each sign dissolved on inspection into game trace or runoff scarring. Around me, the forest kept doing that thing mountain forests do, where distance feels compressed until you try to cross it. Landmarks appeared close, then refused to arrive. At 1:17 p.m., I heard the tone again, and this time I could have sworn it came from behind me. I turned so fast I almost lost footing on loose needles. Nothing there. The slope below was empty. I stood listening until the silence itself started feeling staged. I checked GPS. Good fix. Checked compass. Good bearing. Checked map. Consistent. I laughed once, quietly, to reset myself. People do that alone, more than they admit. Small performance of normalcy. Then I kept going. The old lookout site should have been another 25 minutes. It took nearly an hour and a half. Even now I cannot tell you exactly why. The terrain was not impassable. I was not bushwhacking blind, but every time I thought I had the line, I would hit some minor obstacle that required a small correction. A tangle of downed timber. A rock outcrop that looked passable from below and wasn't. A shallow drainage that bent me sideways. Each adjustment made sense on its own. Together they consumed distance in a way that felt personal. Twice I stopped to verify that I had not somehow drifted into the wrong draw. Both times the instruments supported me. Both times the land looked subtly off from the map in ways I could not reduce to error. Nothing dramatic, just proportions that did not stay put in memory. A stand of dead trunks I would have sworn had been on my left, turning up on my right. A clearing seeming wider when approached from below than when looked back at from above. The sort of thing you can explain individually, right up until the explanations start feeling like substitutes rather than answers. Then I found the footings. 4 concrete pads among grass and low brush, anchor bolts rusted down to ugly brown stumps, 1 length of cable, half swallowed by soil. That was all that remained of the tower. No standing structure, no mystery, just absence with geometry. My first reaction was relief so sharp it felt foolish. There, I thought. Real place, real endpoint, a former thing. The pressure in my chest eased immediately. Then I realized the sound had stopped completely. I made a circuit of the site, photographed the footings, noted debris scatter, found the collapsed outline of the utility shed foundation, maybe 30 yards downslope, exactly where the inventory had suggested. Nothing remarkable. Some old nails, fragments of treated lumber, 1 section of corroded conduit. The whole place had the dead neutrality of many retired sites. You could have convinced me then that the rest of the file had been organizational hysteria grown around ordinary discomfort. I almost left. What kept me there was a detail too small to respect. On the western edge of the clearing, beyond the last footing, somebody had stacked 3 stones on a flat stump, not a cairn for navigation. Too deliberate, too pointless. 1 broad stone, 1 narrow, 1 round on top. It looked like an idea of a marker rather than a useful marker. I might have ignored it if I hadn't also seen, a little farther past it, another stack, then another. Not in a straight line, in a curve. I walked toward them before I had fully decided to. Each stack was made from nearby stone, recent enough that lichen patterns had been turned inward. Human work, casual, but repeated. They continued through the trees, in an arc leading north of the clearing, away from any route that made practical sense. That was where reason should have reasserted itself. This was exactly the kind of thing people do at old sites. Symbolic little constructions. Bored hikers. Some previous worker. Nothing. Nothing at all. But the moment I saw the repetition, my mind moved into the shape Mercer had described. Correspondence. Placement. Sequence. A pattern asking completion from the kind of person who cannot stand unfinished correspondences. I told myself I was only going to follow far enough to determine whether the marker line led to some secondary hazard not noted in the old inventory. Broken foundation, open shaft, illegal camp, unstable debris field, a professional pretext. The prettiest lie I know. The stacks took me downslope first, then along contour through denser timber where the light changed and the forest floor held more moisture. The air cooled. Sound dulled. After maybe 10 minutes, I found a fourth stack knocked over, then a fifth intact beside a tree whose bark had been scored with 3 shallow parallel cuts. Old cuts, not fresh. Tool-made, not animal. I wrote that down too. Then, faintly, from somewhere ahead and below, the tone returned. 3 notes. Pause. 1 longer note. By then I had been alone for hours, and I want to be honest about what solitude does. It does not make you imagine things from nothing. It makes you overinvest the things you do perceive. The sound wasn't louder. It was more meaningful, because now it seemed to answer the root. I knew that was irrational. Knowing did not help. I followed. The trees thinned around a shallow basin I had not expected from the map. Not open ground exactly. More like a depressed fold in the terrain where runoff had once gathered and then changed its mind. Ferns, dark soil, old fallen trunks silvering under moss. In the middle stood what I first took for the remnant of some equipment stand. A ring of metal posts driven waist-high into the earth, 6 of them, connected in places by loops of wire so corroded they looked woven from bark. I stopped dead. It was not on any inventory, not old tower infrastructure, wrong location, wrong design, wrong everything. The posts were placed irregularly, but with obvious intent, and each had a different kind of metal fastened near the top, a little plate on one, a bent strip on another. On a third, something that might once have been a tag bracket, all of it positioned so that wind, if it moved through at the right angle, could make them answer one another. Not machinery. Not exactly. An instrument. My whole body reacted before my mind did. Adrenaline, immediate and humiliating. I remember backing up 1 step, then another, not because I thought it would attack me, but because the existence of it made the rest of the file rearrange all at once. Non-standard acoustic events. Guidance drafts. Circulation increasing exposure. Somebody had found this before me. Somebody had studied it. Somebody had either built it or failed to remove it. The sound came again, and now I knew it came from the basin. Very soft. A thread of tone pulled through the posts by almost no wind at all. I should have photographed it and left. Instead, I approached carefully around the edge. The ground there was pocked with old disturbances. Not holes, more like repeated placements, where something narrow had been driven in and later removed. Survey stakes, maybe, or flags, or temporary markers from some prior investigation. Near one of the posts I found a weathered strip of fluorescent tape, half buried in soil, the kind crews use for trail marking or hazard flagging. Printed on it, still barely legible, hold line. Not a message, just tape from some other use, probably. But in that place, it read, like instruction. I circled farther and saw the notebook. It was wedged under a stone at the edge of the basin, cover warped by moisture but not destroyed. Government issue field book. Green. Standard. I knew before I touched it that I should not touch it. I also knew I was going to. Most of the pages were ruined. The surviving ones were written in pencil, cramped and forceful, then overwritten in places as if the author had returned to earlier entries trying to correct them. The name on the inside cover had blurred into near illegibility, but I recognized enough letters to think it had belonged to one of the original investigators. The entries made less sense the further in I got. Not gibberish. That would have been easier. They were structured notes by someone trying very hard to remain structured. Sound interval not fixed, but expectation of interval increases detection. Avoid translating into melody. Route drift begins after second successful correspondence. Do not validate by repetition. The basin is not the source. Source may be the model produced in approach. That line was underlined so hard the pencil had nearly torn the page. Then, several pages later, removed markers twice, rebuilt by morning, unclear whether by person, subject, or participant remembering form. By then, the air around me had gone so still that I could hear my own sleeve brush against itself when I moved. I looked up from the notebook and had the sudden, vivid impression that the basin had become aware of being read. Not in a supernatural sense. In the older, uglier sense of feeling your own attention become a material thing in a place where it should not matter. I backed away from the notebook without realizing I was doing it. That is when I heard my name. Not shouted, not whispered dramatically, just spoken from somewhere off to my left in the ordinary calling tone of someone trying not to startle you. I turned so fast I nearly fell. A man stood between the trees 20 yards upslope. Late 60s maybe. Lean, hatless, sun-browned face, field jacket gone pale at the shoulders. Not close enough for me to see his eyes clearly. He had one hand raised, palm out. I knew it was Mercer before he said anything. "You stayed too long," he said. My heart was pounding so hard it made me angry. "Were you following me?" "I came because I knew you'd do exactly this." He moved carefully downslope without stepping into the basin itself. I noticed that immediately. He stayed outside the ring of disturbed ground, as if respecting an invisible edge. "You planted those stone markers?" "Not first. After. To break cleaner roots." "That does not mean anything." "It will." He looked at the notebook in my hand and shut his eyes briefly, like a man watching a child discover a loaded tool. "Put it back." Why was this sealed? Because every useful description turned into a map. I was beyond patience by then. Fear tends to strip me down to irritation before it gets anywhere more honest. "This is some old field installation," I said. "Somebody built it, then something went wrong with the response, and everybody wrapped it in language because nobody wanted ownership." Mercer nodded. "That is partly true." "Who built it?" "We don't know." "You investigated and you don't know?" "We investigated the wrong level." He glanced around the basin, as though listening to something I could not hear. "The first assumption was prank, art piece, unauthorized structure, local nonsense. Then we cataloged witness effects and made the second mistake, which was treating the object as the hazard. We focused on the posts, the sounds, the site. But the site only mattered once someone entered it in the right condition. The right condition being what? Looking for completion. I wanted to reject that. I was already rejecting it, internally, even as every step that had brought me there proved his point. He said, "Did you notice how long it took to reach the footings?" I did not answer. "Did the land feel wrong in any way you couldn't make stick?" Still, I said nothing. He watched me for a moment. The hazard isn't hearing the sound. It's beginning to organize movement around its recurrence. Once you start interpreting terrain through the expectation of an underlying arrangement, you stop navigating and start collaborating. That word made my stomach turn. I told him he was talking like a cult leader. He almost smiled. "And yet you're still here." He asked whether I had read the notebook entry about the basin not being the source. I said yes. "Good," he said. "That was the closest we got." "To what?" "To understanding that the object only stabilizes a process already underway. The root makes the listener. The listener makes the pattern. The pattern redefines the route. By the time you reach the basin, you've already done most of the dangerous part yourself. I looked down at the notebook, then at the ring of posts. It suddenly seemed less like an artifact and more like a trap that worked by convincing you that the trap was elsewhere. Then why not destroy it? I asked. We tried. He said it simply. The first time, the district removed the posts and flagged the area closed under general hazard language. Incidents increased for 6 months. People approached from wider angles and arrived with less warning. Second time, we left the site alone and controlled documentation. Incidents dropped. Third time, one of us tried to produce formal guidance, detailed enough to be useful. He disappeared from his route 3 days later. The forest around us had grown so quiet I could hear a small ticking from somewhere in the ring as one piece of metal lightly touched another, then stopped. Mercer held out his hand. Give me the notebook. I should have. Instead, I asked the question that had been building in me since the parking lot call. Why are you helping me? He did not answer at once. When he did, he sounded older than before. Because once you start seeing the correspondences, silence doesn't fully protect you anymore. It only leaves you alone with them. That is not the answer of a healthy institution or a healthy man. It is, however, a very honest answer from someone who has already failed. I handed him the notebook. He slid it back under the stone exactly where I had found it. Then he told me to do something that, in retrospect, was the only practical advice anyone gave me through the entire affair. On the way out, he said, do not check whether you are navigating correctly more than you absolutely need to. Verification is part of it. Pick one line and keep it. When you hear the sound, do not wait for it to repeat. And if the terrain starts feeling like it agrees with you, stop trusting it. That last one lodged in me like a splinter. We left the basin together, but not by the route I had taken in. Mercer led on a line that initially felt wrong to me, too steep and too far east, but he never hesitated. Twice I almost corrected him aloud and stopped myself because I understood, dimly and with growing dread, that the urge to correct was the thing he was warning me about. The sound followed us for a while. Not continuously, just enough to make each silence feel provisional. At one point we crossed a runnel of water I did not remember seeing on the way in. At another we passed one of the stone stacks, then a second, then none. Time became slippery in the stupid, ordinary way it does when fear and concentration narrow your world. I could not later say whether the return trip took 40 minutes or 2 hours. What I can tell you is the exact moment I knew I was no longer dealing with a localized site hazard. We came out on the old lookout clearing from the northwestern side, and the footings were wrong. Not gone, not transformed, just wrong. There were 5. I stopped so abruptly Mercer nearly walked into me. I had photographed 4. I had walked the entire perimeter. I knew there were 4 footings because the tower had been 4-legged and because I had professionally, compulsively documented 4 distinct concrete pads. Now there were 5 pads visible in the grass, one smaller than the others, offset, clearly old. I heard myself say, "No." Mercer did not look surprised, which was somehow worse. "Keep moving," he said. There were 4. I know. You knew this would happen? No, I knew something would. I walked to the nearest footing and looked at it as if enough scrutiny could force reality to become embarrassed and correct itself. The concrete was weathered like the others. Anchor bolts, rust bloom, lichen. Not a fresh hallucination, not some hidden object suddenly noticed. It was integrated into the site in a way that implied it had always been there. I took out my phone to compare the photos and found, with a cold heaviness that has never left me, that every image now showed 5 footings. That is the kind of detail skeptics love, because it sounds like the point where your story has obviously abandoned the world. I understand that. I would have thought the same thing. But listen to what actually broke me in that moment. It wasn't the impossibility. It was the bureaucratic quality of it. The evidence had updated itself neatly. No dramatic glitching. No visible distortion. just a revised record, as if my certainty had been the only outdated component. Mercer took the phone out of my hand and put it back in my pocket. "Do not start building comparison chains," he said. "That's how you stay in it." I wanted to argue, to inventory, to stabilize. Instead, I followed him because there was nothing else left that felt less dangerous. We reached the washed-out spur in late light. The ordinary trail beyond it looked so offensively normal I almost sat down from relief. Mercer stopped there and did not come farther. "You tell anyone exactly what you found," he said, "and they'll either think you're unstable or they'll want details. Both are bad. So what am I supposed to do?" "Reduce root access where you can. Keep language broad. Don't make maps for the curious." "You still think this can be contained by paperwork?" He looked at me then, with something close to pity. "No," he said. "I think paperwork is one of the ways it travels. I also think it's one of the few ways we know to slow ourselves down." Then he turned and went back upslope alone, without another word, and I had the sudden sick certainty that he had done that many times. I made it to the trailhead just before dark. My vehicle was the only one there. I sat inside with the doors locked and my hands on the steering wheel until full night came on around me, because I could not shake the feeling that if I drove away too quickly, I would take the arrangement with me in some more active form. That sounds irrational. It was irrational. By then, rationality had become less like a tool and more like a habit I was performing to keep from noticing how compromised I already felt. At the motel, I laid out everything from my pack on the bed and checked it against my own packing list. Nothing missing, nothing added. Very normal behavior from a man trying to prove to himself that normal behavior still existed. Then I found a strip of fluorescent tape in the side pocket that I had not put there. Weathered, mud stiff, printed with one phrase, repeated in black block letters. "Hold line." I did not sleep at all. The next morning I drove straight back without telling the district I was leaving. Halfway home I stopped at a gas station and opened my notebook to reconstruct the previous day from the timestamps. Some entries were exactly as I remembered. Others had changed tone in ways so slight and yet so invasive that I started sweating in my seat. At 1:17 p.m., where I had written heard tone again, behind me maybe, the line now continued in my own handwriting, which means I'm on the same approach as before. I had no memory of writing that. At the basin notes, under ring of metal posts, I had added later in the margin, "Not built to make sound. Built to confirm arrival." That sentence is mine. I can see how I would write it. I do not remember thinking it. I threw the notebook into the passenger seat and drove the rest of the way, in a state I will not glamorize by calling shock. It was simpler than that. It was violation with paperwork attached. When I got back to the office Monday, the file was still gone. Mercer did not answer when I called the number from the parking lot. It had been disconnected. Carla took one look at me and shut her office door. "You went," she said. It was not a question. I said yes. For a while she just stood there with both hands on the back of her chair. Then she sat down very slowly, as if something old and unwelcome had confirmed itself. "What changed?" she asked. That question terrified me more than anything else had, because it implied she already knew change was the relevant category. I told her as much as I could without sounding insane. The root distortion, the basin, the structure, Mercer, the 5 footings. I did not show her the notebook at first. When I finally did, she only read 3 pages before closing it. "Get rid of this," she said. "That's evidence." "No, it's a handle." We argued quietly for several minutes. It was the most emotional conversation we ever had, though if someone had overheard it, they might have thought we were discussing a budget dispute. That is another thing institutions teach you, how to panic in low tones. In the end, she told me 2 things. First, Mercer had indeed been real. Second, after the original review, he had spent years trying to create a restricted internal doctrine for approaching certain classes of non-propagable anomalies, which was bureaucratic language so ugly it could only have been invented by frightened professionals. Nothing formal came of it, but enough fragments circulated that people stopped inviting him to meetings where records were kept. "Did he disappear?" I asked. "No," she said. "Worse. He stayed employed long enough for everyone to learn how not to hear him." That was the day I understood the sealed file had not been buried because the agency wanted to hide a scandal in the ordinary sense. It had been buried because the agency had no framework for a hazard that became easier to encounter when described precisely, and no way to distinguish real threat from contagious interpretation once the people involved started sounding unreasonable. So they did what bureaucracies do best. They narrowed access, changed category labels, dispersed the problem across offices, and waited for turnover to do the rest. And it almost worked. For a while after that, I did what Carla asked. I reduced the matter to broad recommendations: quiet access discouragement, deferred maintenance on the old spur, vague hazard language around unstable remnants and route unreliability. Nothing inviting, nothing explanatory. I did not put the basin in writing. I did not mention the 5 footings. I did not mention Mercer. Officially, the area became one more low-priority inherited nuisance site in a landscape full of them. Unofficially, I started noticing things. Not dramatic things. That would be easier. Patterns. A district map in a shared packet with one contour line traced twice in different ink, both versions plausible until you look too long. An incident summary from another forest where a trail volunteer described hearing a repeated call that seemed to improve my confidence before I realized I'd left the route entirely. A. Facilities inventory from Idaho, with a hand correction changing a structure count from 4 to 5, initialed by someone who retired 20 years ago. You can explain each of those. I still do, in daylight, when I need to work. But explanation has not undone what the file started. Because Mercer was wrong about one thing. Silence does not protect you once you've seen the correspondences, but speech does not simply spread them either. The worst truth is that after a certain point, you begin generating them on your own. The file does not need to stay open. The route does not need to stay accessible. The basin does not even need to be reached. Once your mind has accepted that some arrangements recruit attention by rewarding completion, the whole world becomes dangerously willing to resemble one. That is why I am telling this carefully. I no longer investigate hazard reports for the Forest Service. Officially, I left for family reasons and private sector consulting. That is easier for everyone. I still get calls, sometimes, from people who know my old specialty and want help reading weird incident clusters. I say no more often than I used to. When I say yes, I have rules now, though not the kind internet horror likes. I do not chase repeated descriptors across districts unless the operational value clearly outweighs the narrative pull. I do not examine audio anomalies more than once. I do not compare witness accounts line by line when those accounts seem to improve one another into coherence. And if a field report contains the kind of sentence that makes me feel personally selected by its intelligence, I back away. That last one is the hardest. A few months ago, a former coworker forwarded me a structure remediation package from a forest nowhere near Montana. She didn't know why it bothered her, just said it had my kind of weirdness, and asked whether the hazard language looked adequate. There was a photo attached. Not of the basin, not of the old lookout site, just a clearing with 4 concrete footings and a smaller 5th pad set slightly apart, like it had always been there. The metadata said the image had been taken 3 years before I ever opened the sealed file. I did not answer her email. Since then, I have been trying to decide which possibility is worse: that there are multiple sites, or that, once the model exists in you, you begin finding it wherever incomplete evidence allows. Sometimes I think Mercer understood that better than any of us, and kept going back not because he believed he could solve it, but because repeated approach was the only way he knew to distinguish external hazard from internal adoption. If that was what he was doing, it did not save him. I found his name last winter in a county death notice from western Montana. No obituary beyond the service date. No survivors listed. The kind of civic disappearance reserved for men who outlive their social category. I did not attend. I still have the strip of fluorescent tape. I should have destroyed it years ago. Instead, I keep it in a metal box with dead batteries, old field IDs, and a compass that no longer settles quickly. Every few months, I take it out to prove to myself it is still only tape, weathered plastic, mud stains, printed words from some supply roll used by countless crews for countless ordinary reasons. Hold line. I used to think the warning in that phrase was obvious. Now, I am less sure. Because lines do not only hold things out, sometimes they hold a shape in place long enough for you to learn it. And once you have learned it, you start seeing where it almost closes. That is the part I should have left sealed. Not the file, not the basin, not the old report with its dead language and missing attachments. The need to finish what something unfinished has started in you. If you work around land long enough, you learn a useful humility. Terrain does not care whether you understand it. Weather does not improve because your map is accurate. Distance is never impressed by confidence. I trusted those lessons because they kept me alive and made me good at my job. What I did not know is that there are patterns that do not punish arrogance. They punish attention. They do not lunge. They do not reveal themselves all at once. They simply begin rewarding the exact habits you are proudest of, until those habits stop belonging entirely to you. Maybe that is all this ever was. A human-made sight, a contagious interpretation, a bureaucracy too frightened of uncertainty to do anything but hide its own confusion. Maybe the fifth footing was stress, and the altered notes were memory, and the rest has been me ever since, finding one durable metaphor and feeding it with coincidence, because some people would rather be haunted than ordinary. I still try that explanation on. It still almost fits. Then I remember the line in the notebook. The basin is not the source. Source may be the model produced in approach. I thought, for years, that meant the trap was cognitive, that the danger was in how the mind organizes signal and route into one another. And maybe that is true. But there is another reading that has kept me awake more nights than I care to count. Maybe the model is not produced in approach by us. Maybe it is produced out there, patiently, every time enough of us take the same kind of interest in the same kind of discrepancy. Maybe all those old reports, all those sealed reviews, all those broad, vague hazard notes, and unexplained access discouragements across public land are not evidence of one place that spread. Maybe they are evidence of one process that keeps discovering where people like me are most likely to volunteer. So here is the only useful thing I have left to say. If your work teaches you to resolve inconsistencies, be careful what kind of inconsistency feels made for you. If a place begins to seem arranged around your expectation that it can be understood, leave before the feeling becomes flattering. And if you ever find yourself reading an old report that looks too thin for the trouble surrounding it, with attachments withheld and language that seems embarrassed by its own precision, do not assume the truth is in what was sealed. Sometimes the seal is the last honest part. Everything after that is just the route teaching you how to arrive.